Is divine hiddenness evil? Well, I don't know. Define your terms. Just don't pretend that your straw man is what atheists are talking about, because invariably it very rarely ever is. Because in this case, it really can't be. Because if it was, they'd have no defense against it. Because the religious are inherently dishonest. And I trust no one is surprised. If you really want to see why religious philosophical arguments fail, this is the video for you. Now, I've been trying to find decent apologetics and decent apologists for quite a while now, and I've entirely failed to do so. But today, with the help of one of my subscribers, I'll take a look at an actual philosopher who honestly fares no better than people like Frank Turek or William Lane Craig. Because all of this is ultimately dumb. It's emotionally comforting nonsense wrapped up with a bow. So let's go take a look. Now, you know I've been on somewhat of a quest to find religious apologists who are not absurdly low-hanging fruit. People who are actually worth paying attention to and aren't just assuming the existence of gods for the emotional comfort of believing in gods. And that's one of the things that I've come up completely empty on, because that's apparently necessary for religious apologetics no matter where you look. They have nothing intelligent to say about the existence of God except, well, of course God exists. But that's not going to impress anyone who isn't willing to leap to that unjustified conclusion. Therefore, one of my kind subscribers suggested I look at a couple of religious philosophers to see how they fare. This time, I'm going to look at an old blog article by Baylor professor of philosophy Alexander Prus as he discusses the problem of divine hiddenness. You know, why in the world, if there's a God, would God be hiding from the rest of us and not just making himself clearly and obviously known? And I'm going to use this as an example of why throwing philosophy into the mix really doesn't help. So let's get to it. So he starts out with, there is a discussion in the literature on whether the argument from divine hiddenness is a special case of the argument from evil. Here is an interesting difference. While many evils like suffering and death are evils no matter whether there is a God, divine hiddenness, the state of affairs of some epistemically virtuous agents not believing in God, can only be evil if God exists. Indeed, if there is no God, then non-belief in God is intrinsically good. And we can see right off the bat that this is a pointless argument to be made because it's based on blind faith, not objective truth. That's all religion is. Wishes and feelings, not facts and evidence, as I pointed out on many occasions. You could have this exact same argument over the characters in the Harry Potter books. And that's one of the major problems that I have with theology. It's just not demonstrably real. You're starting with a fantasy character and pretending that it exists, at least for the sake of argument. What does that actually accomplish? Let's get on to his arguments. 1. Either God exists or God does not exist. 2. If God exists, then there are no unjustified evils. 3. If God does not exist, then divine hiddenness is not an evil. So either way, divine hiddenness is not an unjustified evil. Yeah, but none of that is actually valid or worthwhile. Now, the first premise, obviously, that's the case. Either A or B is true. Something exists or it does not exist. There is no third option. It's a binary proposition. And that's about as close to defensible as he gets. Then, In premise number 2, he states that if God exists, there are no unjustified evils. Well, says who? How does he know that, and how has he objectively tested that assertion to find out if it's true or valid? Because, of course, they don't. They don't even try. Ultimately, they are treating God no differently than they would be treating Harry Potter, like a character in a book, not as an objectively real individual. If all of the things we believe about God are true, then X. Okay, but you haven't proven that any of the things you believe about God are true. Get to work on that. But they can't because they don't care. It doesn't make the slightest bit of difference to them. How do they know that if God is real, then there are no unjustified evils? Which asshole did they yank that one straight out of? Because it simply is not demonstrable. It's a bald assertion, and they're hanging their entire argument on this thing that they can't prove is real. If God does not exist, divine hiddenness is not an evil. Well, if God doesn't exist, then divine hiddenness isn't a thing because there's nothing divine to hide. Virtually all of these philosophical arguments that the religious use are just nonsensical statements based on faith so they can tack "therefore God" on the end. What the hell is the point? He goes on to say, if there were a God, then hiddenness would be an unjustified evil, and claims that can't be the case by simply repeating the second premise that if there is a God, there are no unjustified evils. Again, I ask, says who? If it isn't based on anything credible, then what the hell is the point? What have you demonstrably proven with any of this? Absolutely nothing. Nothing but your own gullibility, anyhow. For any of this to be at all rationally justified, they'd need to prove that there actually is a God of some sort, and we all know they can't do that. They'd have to prove that a God exists, because otherwise this is just a complete waste of time, like debating the finer points of Harry Potter lore and expecting anyone to give a damn. They'd have to show that this God of theirs actually has the characteristics that have been arbitrarily assigned to it. And they're doing absolutely nothing of the sort. This argument is no more intellectually valid than saying, if Harry Potter is real, then he fights against Voldemort. And then pretending that if doesn't actually mean if, it means because. Because Harry Potter is real. But that doesn't actually prove anything. And then he goes on to state the absurd. Divine hiddenness is an evil. If God doesn't exist, divine hiddenness is not an evil. So God exists. No, because you're still operating from a whole bunch of premises that are wholly unproven and unjustified. But this is how religious philosophical arguments operate. They start with unjustified blind faith that something is true. They never question whether or not their premises actually make any rational sense. They're true because they want them to be true. They disguise it all behind if, and then assume it means because, and then philosophically masturbate their way to declaring that their foregone conclusion must be the case. Except they haven't proven a damn thing. And this is why philosophy is so utterly useless for anything like this, because it is the entirely wrong tool for the job. But the right tool shows the theists that they're completely crazy. And they don't like being nuts, so they grab the wrong tool and run with it because it's the only one they can wrangle into saying what they want it to say and pretend that they've somehow done something useful. And they're completely wrong. Hiddenness is not the only case where this logical issue comes up. It comes up in the case of any state of affairs that has the property that necessarily it is an evil only if God exists. In all such cases, the state of affairs simply cannot be an unjustified evil, and one has an argument from the state of affairs being an evil to God existing. Blasphemy against God is another such state of affairs. And I wouldn't argue that divine hiddenness is only evil if God exists. I would say belief in anything without objectively verifiable evidence or logically valid arguments is downright evil and stupid and wrong. And none of what the religious present are valid at all. Just because the syllogistic form is right, that doesn't mean that the argument is true. Personally, I would say that any entity which purportedly and willingly hid itself when it could make itself known, then punishes people for not believing it exists, that entity is evil by every rational definition of the word. And this isn't just for a god. If Bigfoot had the power to punish people for not accepting it existed and continued to hide in the woods, then Bigfoot would be evil. If Kim Jong-un hid in his palace and never ever came out and nobody had ever seen him, yet he instructed his government to put unbelievers in gulags, he'd be evil too. Which, all right, he is, but he'd be doubly evil too. This doesn't rely on a god. It relies on the entity in question not being a complete douchebag. That's what we mean by the problem of divine hiddenness. God is supposedly, and I have to say supposedly because at this point, God is no more than a fantasy character in a book of mythology, but God is supposedly holding people responsible for knowledge that he is purposely withholding from them, and that's a complete dick move. And I don't know how anybody with a brain can argue against that. And then he goes on to say, and if it could be shown that, necessarily, there is only evil if God exists, then this would mean that all arguments from evil are in this boat. Which is complete nonsense because we can formulate ideas about evil today with or without any God actually being existent. That's only the case if you're talking about objective evil, which outside of the delusionally religious, nobody actually thinks is real. It's just yet another characteristic baldly stapled onto this imaginary deity of theirs and treated as real because it makes people feel good. And that's dumb. It really is. None of this means that there is no argument from hiddenness for atheism that's worth discussing. It just means the one shouldn't see it as just a special case for the problem of evil. No, it just means you don't understand the argument that you're arguing against. This is painfully common in religious circles, though. They don't understand the problem of evil, not remotely, as we've seen around here many, many times before. They aren't paying attention to what we're saying because what we're saying hurts their feelings. Therefore, they just go ahead and reformulate our arguments into straw men so they can tear them apart without ever once addressing the argument we're actually making. And I wish I could say this was uncommon, but we all know that it isn't. Nobody is saying what he's saying, because what he's saying necessarily presupposes that there's a God, and we're not doing that. His side has to, but we're not. We're just pointing out that all of the characteristics that the religious have arbitrarily assigned to their deity, assigned without being able to prove that either their deity exists at all or actually has any of those characteristics objectively, none of it makes any sense whatsoever when we examine those characteristics in aggregate. You simply cannot have an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing deity given what we see in the universe. It just doesn't work. And if you notice, a lot of apologists are realizing that we're right, and they're starting to say, well, God isn't really like that. Okay, fine. You've learned your lesson. Stop believing it. Stop preaching it. Realize that you don't have much of a God at all in that case. That's our point. Concede it. Be honest for once in your misbegotten life. But they don't want to do that because it's going to cost them their followers, and thus it's going to cost them their money. Because at the end of the day, all of this is just total bullshit spread for a paycheck. And he finishes this whole thing up with this. For a part of this pattern of hiddenness is that some people have thought long and hard about whether God exists. And it's not clear that they would have been likely to think long and hard about whether God exists if there were no God. Yeah, fuck you. Honestly, does this idiot live in a cave? How much has been written about Harry Potter? How many books have been written about Star Wars or Star Trek? None of that is real, but people have been thinking about it for decades. People are still writing about Arthurian legends. This is really painfully stupid when you think about it, but the religious never think rationally about anything they believe, do they? That's the problem. We're asking them to, and they refuse. They can't quite figure out why we're not buying into their bullshit, and this is why. Because their bullshit doesn't make any sense. Once you step outside of their emotionally comforting bubble, they're a complete laughingstock. And even if Prus was anywhere remotely close to being correct, and he's not, how does that prove the Christian God? Because people have spent centuries thinking about other gods, far longer than Christianity or even Judaism has even existed. Yet he doesn't think those gods are valid, does he? Because this isn't about fact, it's about emotionally comforting fantasy. And you can go through any of his arguments and replace the word God with anything. Anything at all. Make something up. It really doesn't matter. Make something up and the argument doesn't change. Because philosophy is the wrong tool for making any of these determinations about the real world. But they have nothing else, so they're just running with it, even though it leads absolutely nowhere useful. Because they don't care. Because they just want to feel good. And that's dumb, my friends. It's absurdly and laughably dumb. Boom, 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 boom.